we do not have an issue with.
Sorry, I don't know if
Likely going to be using the raising hand thingy on Zoom. So if this is okay with us all, we will be.
We are unsure. The very nature of emotions or the way we were trained leaves us always constantly second guessing as to what they mean for us and what do they imply, what to imply in this world. And we often think the way that we are taught to understand these things puts us in a position where we are vulnerable to these emotions and follow the whims that these emotions dictates towards us. What do we think that this motion looks like, or who does this motion? We think that this motion is primarily done by parents because, one, they are the first teachers and often do have the close connection to be able to teach these things to the children. So we think the way that parents would instruct these to their children is, one, exposure in order to teach them these things. So it looks like, one, encouraging children to be critical of their own emotions, or the parents themselves trying to rationalize their own emotions. So if a dad is angry or comes home frustrated from work, he explains or openly explains that why he feels that way, that he's angry because his boss did not understand what he was presenting, or his boss was not willing to help him with what he was doing. Second, we think it's telling them that you can deal with most emotions or most struggles by being able to rationalize these things. So if you face a problem at school or if you face a problem at work, you're able to better understand these things by breaking them down and finding concrete solutions towards them. But third, it's helping our children process these emotions as well, helping them rationalize their emotions, like saying emotions are valid, but you do not act on them or do not use them in conflict. So being angry is okay, but that doesn't mean that you should shout or hit another kid. So we think that these are different ways that people can deal with emotions in a logical manner, and we think that these are things that lead into other logical senses as well. But we don't think that children will become robots because of this, because as human beings, you're likely to feel emotions eventually because it's just hardwired into our system. You can't train a kid to become a robot. But we think that eventually, because you will meet influences or you will feel emotions such as someone yelling at you or meeting your first love, we think that the key difference here is that you are not left vulnerable to those emotions, or you are not left confused by those emotions, but rather you have the tools equipped to be able to better rationalize these things and to be better able to handle these things when the point they happen. So two arguments that come from opening government today. The first argument is why it's necessary for their budding years in three distinct ways, and second, why we think that this better shelters them or prepares them for the future. So first, why do we think it's necessary for their budding years? We think it's for parent relationships. Because why? We think that most often children end up not understanding their parents, or parents do not understand their children. For example, as a child, I would throw a tantrum if I could not get a toy, and to my parents, they would just call me a brat and not understand that it may be because that toy means something to me, or I do want something in that toy. And we think that it's because of these disjuncts or these miscommunications or this inability for me to rationalize or for them to be able to try to understand me is what often leads me to internalizing that it could have been my my fault, that maybe I am a brat, that maybe I am selfish, and that's often lead to deep-seated trauma that often means that that I carry on to my later years. How does this better happen? We think when we tackle these things in a logical manner and we are able to better rationalize how these things happen, it allows me to, at least on the onset, better able to express how I feel about these things, or express that I really do want this toy. This is my superhero and I do want to play with him. Or it better helps my parents explain to me that we don't have the money for it now, but this doesn't mean it's no forever, but it can be for tomorrow. So I think that these are ways that the child better understands that it's not his fault, but rather there are different circumstances that prevent him from being able to get what he wants, as opposed to a world where the child just feels misunderstood. We think that this is also better for peer disputes, because we think that when a child goes to school, it is inevitable that he will meet bullies, or inevitable that he will be targets of things like racism or hate crimes. We think at the point it happens, the problem here is that when this child meets these kinds of confrontations, they often feel like it is something that is wrong with them, that, oh, they are being bullied because of who I am, or I'm being bullied because I'm a bad person. But rather, the truth is, in most cases, that children are bullied simply because there are cliquish manners, or there are kinds of tribes that schools do have. And we think that these behaviors, when a child is able to better understand, are better able to understand that it's not on his part, but better able to understand that it could be things that could be changed. Or, for example, if I'm being bullied, I do not have to take revenge on the bully, because that would lead to more things. But rather, I could tell it to a teacher or ask a teacher to help me out. And these are better solutions as opposed to reacting emotionally. But third, we think it's better just for self-worth issues, because children problems are often things that parents cannot predict, such as things like divorce. We think that when children face divorce, it also goes towards the same thing, that they feel like in that emotional response that it is their fault and that they had to do something about it, or they failed to do something. We think that being able to process these things or these emotions better gives them more tools in being able to diversify how they handle these issues. So we think that all these confrontations that children grow up with or not understanding often leads them to internalizing different traumas, which often keeps kids from A, being able to be confident enough for the future, or B, being able to be emotionally resilient and being able to emotionally understand how things happen. So we think that at the point in time, children will find emotions or will have to deal with emotions. They are better equipped to do so. But before I move on, I'll take the POI.
Ethan, you're inconsistent because you're saying that children should not prioritize emotion and put logic forward, but you're also saying that children are more in tune with the emotions on your side. How they're gonna able to do this if they're not used to dealing with their emotion and prioritizing to express how they feel?
Belle, the simple difference is the way we respond, the emotional response to things often means that we follow what we are feeling. So if I'm feeling angry, I have an inclination to want to yell. The logical precision that comes into this is being able to take a step back and analyze, why are those emotions there in the first place, or are those emotions things that I should feel like? So there's a level of internalization, or a level of you trying to understand how these things happen. So I don't think it's inconsistent. But second, on long-term harms, because we think it's the interest of parents to prepare you for the future, which is why you're forced to go to school despite children wanting to stay home instead. The reason why we think that this is important is because we live in a world that is uncertain and volatile. We don't know when these children may experience big life changes like the 2008 financial crisis or the COVID crisis. We think that what happens is, if we deprioritize logic, is that one, our ability to respond rationally becomes less, because in our formative years, all we ever knew was to act on our instinct. This is hard to unlearn once we are used to it, because it's something that we've always relied on. But second, this is worsened by the fact that when we are adults, diplomacy and rational behavior is often the expectation. Using court systems like negotiations, if we do not form these skills earlier, it means that these things are largely inaccessible for us. But third, adult life, we are not shielded from the consequences that we experience. A lot of bad things happen, like heartbreak and unemployment. If we react emotionally, we are more likely to make radical decisions. And that's why there were high suicide rates during the 2008 financial crisis. The reason why this better helps them is because teaching them in the formative years makes the retention of this more likely to be permanent, given that it's a second nature for them. So at first, they might have to do it consciously, but as you continue to do things consciously, you start to do it in parallel. You start to do it without thinking about it. So it becomes second nature. It's easier for you to do. In conclusion, we think that in order to raise our kids the right way, we have to ensure that they have the tools necessary to understand the world better. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that.
I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Cool. All right. Time starts in 3, 2, 1. Two commentaries on side opening government. Firstly, they don't give us a trade-off. Their entire case is about the need for emotional and logical balance. That's to say, being able to approach emotions and logic in a balanced way so we're rational about them. There's no trade-off there, panel. Recognize that the motion clearly states that this motion comes at the cost of emotional bandwidth. They've not at any point given us the definition or a image of what that cost looks like. I think they're being disingenuous with this debate. Srini will tell you more on why that's a problem. Secondly, I think there's a chicken and egg problem in side opposition's case as well. They tell us that the reasons why adults behave badly is because they lack logic. I would say it's the opposite. The reason why adults behave badly is because they've been trained to put aside their emotion. They never get the chance to develop emotional maturity or therapy. And that's why we often have extreme and radical reactions to situations, is because we're often taught to already hide our emotions, to already react to them in a way that makes us feel guilty when we act excessively. I think that's why you have things like domestic abuse problems. That's why you have things like angry dads, because their whole lives dads been told that's just not the way that we're supposed to do this. I want to give you two important burdens in this debate. Firstly, why this is necessary a pillar of childhood that leads to things like identity and formation. And secondly, the impacts that this has in the process of growing up and developing things like empathy, emotional maturity, and identity formation. Firstly, though, we would say that the premise of this argument is that emotional balance and logical balance is important for childhood. Recognize that emotions are very, very important. They're often necessary for understanding and self-discovery. The premise here is that emotions are often the first reactions we use to understand our world. 3 Max here. 1, emotions are how we determine what we like and dislike. This just comes on a natural, like innate human thing of like the foods we eat, the clothes we wear, the colors we like, the classes we like to take, the ways in which teachers treat us and other people treat us. We experience through our emotions. I think that hiding these things away or teaching us to approach them in a logical manner necessarily comes with the trade-off of just the innate human reaction that we have to things. But secondly, the second mech here is that emotions are often the ways in which we formulate our identity, because oftentimes the ways in which we express ourselves move beyond just like whether or not it's a good or bad like problem-solving situations. Often just like I like to wear a certain type of clothing because that's just the way that I want to live my life. I don't think that these are things that can often be touched by the logical like approach that side opposition is taking. But the third mech here, and super important, is that emotions are often the ways in which we develop things like empathy, the ways in which we develop things like the dynamics of our friendships. Our personal growth is based on how we approach life and how we feel better about our approach to life. The important thing here, therefore, is the second premise of the argument, that empathy is particularly crucial. One, for yourself. Children are already often punished for being like seen as emotional and like unable to like logically calculate or like matriculate things, and therefore often made to feel like their problems aren't real, or often made to think that their problems are things that have to hide away. These are the ways in which you inculcate trauma when you make children feel little or belittled or unimportant because they can't rationally tell you why they're throwing a tantrum. I think oftentimes logic is something that can always be developed through things like school, through things like maturity, through things like just approaching problems in life. Emotional maturity is necessarily a sunk cost here at the point in which you're teaching your child that they shouldn't be emotional about things, that they shouldn't throw a tantrum and should instead like have a discussion with you about these things. I think those discussions are prerequisite based on just recognizing the emotions are a valid and justifiable thing, and it's okay for you to feel bad just because you didn't get your favorite toy. I think what you do on your side of the house is reduce that empathy for the child to be able to understand their emotions, understand why they're feeling the things that they are, if they're to hide them away or think about them rationally. But the second mechanism here is that you lose the ability to develop empathy for others. This is to say that oftentimes the ways other people experience things can't always be logically comprehended. Emotional maturity, therefore, is the ways in which we are able to like move ourselves outside of our bodies and approach other people in a manner that allows them to understand and put ourselves in their shoes. I think that is also necessarily lost at the point in which you are losing emotional bandwidth. Humans, the underlying conclusion of this argument, therefore, at panel, is that humans are emotional. That can't be undermined. And I think undoing so comes at some very problematic costs. Before I go on, I'll take CG.
Right. So insofar as we can process emotions logically, and insofar as those discussions can exist prior to an emotive response, why is any of this exclusive?
Because firstly, like oftentimes the emotive response are the first responses we have. The ability to understand why those responses are happening, the ability to understand like why it's okay to express those things is, I think, super valuable. At the point in which not everyone like lives in the world like a robot or has the ability to matriculate those things, I think emotional maturity being developed first, or at least being prioritized, is super important. You're not dealing with our costs here. The second thing is to say is that is that children are in a particularly developmental phase. This is a time when emotions are allowed to run wild, right? Like children are just necessarily given more freedom to do these things because they're kids, right? Like it's okay for them to speak out. I think this is the stage where developing the emotional maturity is therefore super important. I think there's 3 impacts when you don't prioritize that. Firstly, you inculcate fear and suppression within a child who feels like they can't talk or shouldn't talk. I think this is particularly important for neurodivergent kids who have things like ADHD, depression, or mania, which oftentimes like means that emotions rule us in a way that otherwise don't happen, right? Like I think for those particular types of children, this is a particularly destructive case because they're made to feel like their divergence is one that's something that should be punished and illogical and therefore feel like can't be taken seriously. Secondly, you can't develop emotional maturity in the same manner that you would be otherwise because you're just literally taught not to engage with those things in the same way or feel them as valid or justifiable. But thirdly is on identity formation, right? Like if we can't formulate our identity based on what we like or dislike, our ability to express ourselves is also necessarily stunted. But the fourth problem here is on just a gender imbalance with this motion, right? Recognize that women are already punished and seen as emotional because they have like certain biological tendencies that are portrayed in like media as such. These aren't always the case, but I think these are the types of emotions that particularly hurt minorities at the point at which minorities are like people who are trans or people who want particular pronoun preferences are often taught that they're prioritizing their feelings over emotion because they should just be logical and approach it the fact that like society won't change and therefore we should logically approach this in a manner that says that if you can't change something or can't express people to feel how you feel, then you shouldn't care about it. These apply to things like microaggressions where other people, because they can't understand, feel that they're illogical. Recognize the premise of this argument panel that logic itself is a subjective scenario that's painted by power. What power determines is logical, what your environment determines is constrained, is often the thing that's considered like rational to do, and anything that's oppositional to that is considered emotional. This particularly applies to the small ways in which we are developed or traumatized by bullying, by microaggression, et cetera, et cetera. These are also lost, particularly for neurodivergent people. The trade-off, therefore, in this debate panel is that emotional maturity and the ability to develop is a sunk cost. It's something that like most adults don't even have and takes a lifetime to develop. Logic, on the other hand, can be taught in schools, can be taught in classes. It's something you naturally develop over time as you face problems. I think, therefore, it's better to develop emotional bandwidth first. On all those grounds, proud to oppose.
Prime Minister, here.
Hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. So I will also prefer not to be interrupted, but if in case like you can't, type it in the chat, I will ask for one eventually. Hopefully one from closing for the sake of, what? There's a clear difference between rationalizing your emotions and actively repressing them, which is why it was clear coming from the context and the frame that my partner gave to you earlier that the way we're going to teach these children isn't to say that you're not allowed to be angry, but anger is valid, but you shouldn't act on that specific anger. So being angry is okay as long as you don't hit other people as a result of that anger, as long as you don't shout at other people as a result of that anger, and that's the way that you deal with these specific types of conflict. This means that a lot of the call out that emotions are still important are still going to exist in our model. What is then the explicit trade-off? We understand that because children will grow up thinking that rationalization and being able to rationalize their emotions are so important, maybe they don't understand why people scream. Maybe they don't act on their emotions significantly enough and they don't get to develop that emotional response. We posit that that's something that's absolutely okay, especially when in the future, these are things that are not rewarded and are even punished in the future. When, for example, when you're angry and you're shouting, you're often fired from your job. And I think these are things that are explicitly not going to change anytime soon, which is why we're willing to to take that trade-off. The first question I want to answer is, do we actually make sure that we get to help these few select individuals that opening opposition wants to talk about? They said, number one, we're going to harm these specific types of individuals because we're telling them that it's not okay to speak out. Notice that a lot of the things that they argued are so value neutral. Things like speaking out can actually even happen much likelier when you're able to rationalize your feelings. Because when you are just acting on emotions, when you're just crying, when you're just shouting, you have nothing to be able to speak about because you don't understand what you're feeling you yourself. I think it's better to speak out in our model because you're forced to be able to think about these questions. You are given guide questions by your parents to be able to rationalize these types of emotions, and I think that's greater. But I think that this debate is definitely not about being neurodivergent. Obviously, this doesn't talk about kids that have absolutely a significantly harder time to be able to process these types of emotions. That's an entire mental disease and mental type of thing, which can be treated by other things like medication, for example, to lessen their types of temperament, which I think is a very different debate. But I think that's illogical because their argument assumes if we shut them down, then that's a bad thing. I would posit that they're more likely to get shut down when they're crying, when they're shouting, because number one, other children that they're probably responding to will also feel bad that somebody's shouting to them, which is why they're also likely to shut them out of the conversation or get mad at them even more. So there's no healthy dialogue there. But number two, even other adults, when they're seeing children crying or when they see children shouting at other individuals, are also not receptive of this type of behavior. Schools, for example, often punish children who do things like bullying or who act out in an angry response. So I don't understand why they're more likely to get hurt than their model when institutions don't necessarily accept this to begin with. But even if it's true, maybe it's true that there are some POCs or minorities that are expected to be logical, even if they're more in tune with their emotions. We think that that going for that trend and being adaptable to that trend is more important because they said it themselves. 50% of the world is women. POCs are often forced to be logical instead of radical. We think that kind of expectation is exactly why we must conform, because if it's true that these are expectations, they will be expectations regardless. Because of things like, number one, the patriarchy still existing, telling women that they are emotional, therefore they should act a bit more logical, are still going to exist regardless of which generation we are living in. Number two, there's definitely a corporate incentive to keep negotiation and diplomacy the norm, especially since a lot of people, like a lot of the time, things like negotiations are a large corporate activity. We think that there's an incentive even for corporations to do that. Lastly, governments also have an incentive to make emotional responses less because we don't want violence to happen on the street. What does this mean? This means that the expectation will still exist on their model outside these children, and therefore, if they're going to be called out for being emotional, I would posit that it's much better for them in the future to be able to respond logically and to be able to even if it comes to a point of suppressing that emotion. I think it's better because at least they're gonna be heard in this model. If they're just gonna riot on their streets, if they're just gonna shout as a woman, claiming that they've been harmed, for example, they're not gonna be listened to. People are gonna call them unreasonable. People are gonna call them irrational, and people are gonna say they're a nuisance to society. It's significantly better when you get to communicate your thoughts, because when you can communicate your thoughts, other moderates are able to understand what you're going through as well, and there's significantly less attacks that people can do to you or that media can do to you to invalidate your specific types of concerns. So even in that model, I think we effectively win. Second question I'm going to ask is, where do we get more balance? Because they said empathy is important, which to some degree we agree on, right? We assume that emotions are important. But I would argue that we're not just going to leave children to understand their emotions on their own. The fact that this is a parent doing this specific type of activity means we're most likely going to guide them. We're going to help them through their process. If they're going to cry, we're going to say, you have to ask these specific questions to understand why you're crying and tell me why you're exactly crying. So we're not going to leave them to it. We're definitely going to help them until they reach a point where they're likely able to do it for their own, which is why I think they're still going to understand that they're still going to be good to themselves. The second thing that they said is that we're going to be bad to others. This is illogical because it assumes that just because we're emotional beings, that means we will always be nice to each other. There are negative emotions, Madam Chair, that exist in this world. You can also be angry at people, and I would argue that in the weighing of things, it's significantly better to rationalize things first and maybe wait a while before you become nice to people versus allowing these negative emotions to be in play, especially when they're significantly unchecked. Before I move on, closing.
If you're saying that the norm now is being more rational, don't you think we have the chance to change it now through our children by teaching them to deal with their emotions first before rationalizing it?
No, because I told you that there's so many other institutional, structural incentives to keep that at play. But even if that was true, I would posit that the short-term harms of subjecting the youth to that change, to make them social battering rams, to be able to change the world into an emotional response, is something that is bad, because those are irreversible, and the irreversible birthing pains of that change will significantly harm the children. But even if it's true that, for example, children are more in tune with their emotions, I would argue that it's better, because this serves as a counter narrative to that natural emotional response. This assumes this concedes that emotions will always be a natural incentive and a natural part of people, because we are emotional beings. And if we're always naturally emotional, it is significantly better if we have a counter narrative that asks us to tune down those emotions. That concedes that emotions will still exist in our model, even if significantly less. They don't get to have rationality fiated on their model, because it's not a natural thing that people have. I think having it as a safe counterbalance is in and of itself a natural good. What then is the clear extension that I'm going to give to you on our model? Notice that prioritizing rationality is also prioritizing the safety of these children when we don't get to take care of them. Things like grooming, things like teachers being predatory of their children, especially when the emotional response is to trust them because they're nice, because they are in bright colored uniforms, or because they're smiling at me, is normally the things that children experience. When we ask them to think rationally, when we ask them to think about the logic, they're less likely going to approach these types of strangers. They're less likely going to be vulnerable to these types of instances when we do not get to protect them. What is the clear conclusion that you should get from my speech? While it is true that maybe we have a chance to change the norms in the future, the children should not, as parents, our children should not be the ones who have to do that, because we care about our children and we don't want them to be harmed. The certainty that there's some level of safety in our model is always going to be more beneficial than the probabilistic idea that we get to change norms or that we get to benefit some sort of emotional response in the future. Thank you.
Three, two, one. Two OG speeches, no acceptance of a trade-off. As if there is nothing that is expensed under their world as the cost for pertaining to logic constantly. What is the expense under their world? As they claim, it's constantly thinking about what your next steps are, constantly thinking about what your reactions ought to be, i.e., it is less time thinking about what truly your emotions are, why you feel bad about it, and once you're having these outbursts, speaking less about what it makes you feel like, speaking more about what you should do, as they explained in their bullying example. But secondly, it is also, as they claim, is to feed into this toxic societal narrative that you should feel bad about being emotional, i.e., telling children and belittling their problems and saying that if you have an emotional response, you don't get access to anything, period. i.e., you're less and less likely to, they're less and less likely to feel the need to express their emotions because they think any emotional outbursts are bad. I don't think, panel, they can co-opt everything by saying that there is no expense. I think they lose automatically because of this. I'll first tell you why. Two things first. I'll first tell you why, panel, that they have their priorities flipped, i.e., they think that children need to be logical now to be logical in the future. I'll break this down as to why this is not true. Second, I'll tell you why things like things like trauma, from bullying, etc., or rationalizing your temper tantrums, all these necessary things that they say that a child needs is on comparative better under our world. And lastly, I'll talk about minorities and why we are more likely to be empathetic to them under our world than them. First, in terms of reversing the order of what is more important. Panel, notice this first, that society teaches logic and increases the propensity of teaching logic as you grow up. That is to say, with more complex education, but second, also because they give you more and more important roles in society. But third, you're just around more spheres. So for example, we debate and we try to be as logical as we can. So you're in that environment. What is not true, however, is the more you grow up, the less opportunity you have to be emotional. Why is this important, panel? Because Sarim told you the prerequisite of being able to rationalize your emotions and like logically handle it is understanding, realizing, and really staying in that emotional state for long enough for you to realize what it is you truly like or dislike about it, because it isn't as simple as 2 + 2 = 4. What this means is, panel, under their world, children lose the timeline through which they can spend in this emotional discovery, because they're forced to grow up and forced to act like people who protest, people who like need to be in the parliament and be very logical and things like that, panel. We think we safeguard this emotional discovery time so that when you truly eventually have to go up, you can spend more time being rational, and because you know what your emotions truly are. Because as a child, you were allowed to cry. As a child, you were allowed to throw emotional tantrums, and you weren't allowed to, just like you weren't forced your way through it. So I think that panel takes out most of their argumentation as to why being logical is a necessity for success. We tell you emotional discovery is like prerequisite to all their logical rationalizing benefits. So we take that. Second, and this is also quite crucial, they talk about trauma accumulation and things like that. First, I want to talk to you about like two things, panel, that they didn't rebut. First, that humans are just like naturally emotional. And it's often the most hard to understand because each human emotion is different. There's prescriptions for logic, at best case under there. Well, even logic itself is gray, but human emotions are more subjective and gray. But second, panel, we also told you that your identity is likely to be based on how much time you spend behind, again, crying about not being able to wear a particular t-shirt, or like crying about not being able to go to your favorite soccer game, or like having an anger outburst if someone mistreats your friend. The more time you spend behind why or not you like or dislike these things, the more likely you'll be able to understand why, like who you really are and what churns out these sorts of reactions, and thus be able to shape your identity. If all of this is true, given that this was unrebutted, I think you're less likely to accumulate trauma under our world, because the comparative under their world, panel, is someone bullied you, think about what to tell your teacher. Under our world, someone bullied you, you cry, and if they call you emotional, that's fine, because emotions, like being in touch with your emotions, isn't a bad thing. Presumably, yes, there's a social stigma under our world too. But I think the social stigma decreases when we teach a generation that being emotional is fine, right? I don't think you can get access to that under their world. But before I move on, CEO. Sorry, CG, my bad.
The presumption of your side of the debate is that emotions will be controlled by the people. But insofar as things like perversive advertising, populism, why are emotions likely to be interpreted in a consensual manner?
I mean, when you're a child, populism and advertisement are less likely to come to your periphery because parents are there and things like that. I mean, like again, I just told you the propensity of your emotions being manipulated only increase with time. You're more likely to be honest about your emotions as a kid. All right. So I think accumulation of trauma decreases under our world the moment in time we don't stop belittling like children's emotions, because it starts with something small and accumulates. Under their world, you say that don't cry over this, think about next step. Under our world, you're like, okay, cry over this and let's talk things out. All right. Lastly, let's talk about empathy, panel, because I think this is quite crucial. I think, panel, they say that people will shut you down. I already told you generationally why we're more likely to fix this on the comparative. But second, panel, I think when you wear your emotions like an armor, it's less likely to hurt when corporations and government call you emotional. I already told you logic is asymmetric in the power of in the power of the people who can control logic, right? But under our world, panel, the moment in time minorities or women who are always called emotional has the ability to stay emotional and be proud of it is when they're more likely to not take heed to the fact that they're just constantly called emotional under their world. Empathy on net for minorities increase under our world because emotions isn't a bad thing anymore. For all of these reasons, very proud to oppose.
2, 1. Children must be equipped to deal with evil tricksters that aim to convince us that our emotions are our own. But in the current age of political rhetoric and corporate marketing machinery, where advertising, propaganda, nativism appeals to hatred, emotion, and tradition, these emotions are often manipulated in nefarious ways that effectively manufactures consent. Number one, advertisers have an incentive to control people's preferences to sell products to children. This creates an addiction to social media and mental health declining. Number two, political agents have incentives to indoctrinate narratives of hate, control, and nationalism to secure their power. Thirdly, these people have the money and power to do this. This is why advertising, PR, and internet trolling is a multi-billion dollar industry today. Teaching children these strategies also enables them to correct and deal with the problems associated with advertisement and propaganda. They gain the ability to combat states, MNCs, big corporations that aim to capitalize and manage people's emotions. The problem arises when people give in to these emotions that may or may not be their own, without the ability to distance themselves from what they feel and make decisions based off of what they really need. In order to solve that, we need to first equip our children with the necessary safeguards, since conditioning them starts earlier. This outweighs OO because people's emotions are tampered with and weaponized, and therefore people do not have the ability to make informed decisions to access their preferences. So catering to emotions are not as valuable as they claim. Emotions are not the same as long-term and personal desires and sources of happiness. Secondly, this clarifies OG's urgency and why specifically we need to do this policy as early as possible for children in particular, and why alternatives like school are insufficient or uncomparative. The first thing I'm going to prove is why emotional approach to life makes individuals act in ways that are harmful, which clarifies the need to teach logical approaches to life in particular in a way that OG does not. Emotional care comes from socialization and external means, people learning from experiences, being guided based on what feels good, and often can learn and ask from social situations and rise abroad in terms of broad mental health. I think that these are heightened states of irrational decision making for three reasons. Number one, emotions are remnants of biological instincts for environments that we no longer live in. Geneticality, tribalism, selfishness, hunger, and overeating, these were things that were good in the environment with scarce food and predators everywhere. But today this leads to problems with obesity, overcompetitiveness, and isolationism. These, what we interpret as emotions, are in fact instincts left behind by the remnants of hunter-gatherer society. Number two, they are often sourced from deep-seated psychological needs and how often your childhood turned out. Things like, for example, broken families lead to increased feelings that make people seek out security in relationships, and life paths that lock people into terrible life paths before they are ready. I think that building the habit of relying on emotion makes it harder to stop because your nervous system gets used to firing the same signals. Your first instinct will create a snowball into perpetual cycles fueled by emotional, eventual regret, and primarily emotional responses before any consciousness. This means that we cannot trust decisions that are influenced by emotions. They lead us to life paths that are unnecessary, make us less happy as a whole, and overall bad decisions that cannot be justified. On the macro level impacts, this is especially true when advancements in the field of political sciences and corporate marketing have allowed the nefarious actors and entities to influence behavior in ways that people do not understand, and thus make people feel like these emotions needs they need to meet, like the cathartic Trump rallies or retail therapy. This looks like three things: political polarization, as political decisions are forged primarily by rhetoric and ingrained principles that individuals do not understand enough to change. Secondly, the prominence of religions, tradition, and blind reliance on authorities without ensuring people can consent because their valuation of these things are not rooted in an understanding of themselves or what they value. Thirdly, massive alienation. How do we deal with OO's analysis on sunk cost? Okay. The next thing that I'm going to prove is I will resolve the chicken and egg debate, which proves the logic comes from the which proves that the frameworks that you create, when you prioritize logic first, you eventually handle emotions in a way that is better. Why is the logical approach more intrinsically important for people? Number one, a logical approach can lead into how we manage our emotional and mental well-being, i.e. scheduling free time, breaks, and even in the status quo, you don't feel like it, messaging your friends and checking up on them, because you know that psychologically, it leads to a scientific guide to managing emotions more effectively. Number two, most people have poor willpower and cannot overcome their emotions through sheer force of will. What separates top performers and average Joes is not grit or willpower, but their ability to design and put themselves in an environment to bring out their skill, e.g. going to the gym, finding a mentor, joining a club to ensure commitment. It means doubling down, getting good second opinions, and running tests using scientific methods in terms of doing things like mindfulness, meditation, and going to therapy, creating incentives for people to popularize therapy, mental health, and access to emotional management industries. And secondly, it allows people to overcome and create external support structures. Everyone on opposition assumes that an understanding of your emotions means that you will know how to deal with these emotions. But note that we do not know how these people will react. And often it leads to harms that I characterized earlier. Note that most people don't want to go to therapy because there's an emotional aversion that comes from the current stigma against it. But it is an understanding that you may need help because you are pushing people away that drives people towards these channels. A logical approach to managing your emotions is the basis for most self-care, anger management, and striking appropriate balance between people. The trade-off is, even if we have repression, we teach people how to fix this. But number two, they don't make bad decisions about college, about their lives, and are more likely to gain more income and be secure, which is a prerequisite to everything else that exists in this debate. This logic does not apply towards personal well-being, but leads into professional lives as well. Being adept at analyzing scenarios and concepts leads into our ability to make better decisions as a whole. This looks like professional strategies used by HR to manage conflict resolution and communicate strategies employed by the public relations industry to influence the public and the people. These logical frameworks to deal with the social emotional problems. Before I move on, are there any POIs from OO?
Yeah, I don't understand why children poorly reacting to their emotions is a worse harm than under your world, people growing up not understanding their emotions and being less empathetic and accumulating trauma.
Look, you don't prove the value of in and of itself understanding emotions. What we try to prove to you is that even if at childhood it is more difficult, at the very least, when you move closer towards your adulthood, you are better able to create frameworks that allow you to understand emotions in a better way. The problem with making understanding your emotions your primary goal in today's debate is because individuals' emotions are often controlled by factors that make them act in irrational ways. So even if you understand what you feel like you want, if you give into these are not things that benefit you in the best ways and make you the happiest. Rather, they are ways that create short-term satisfaction, but don't actually solve problems at their roots because you don't have the frameworks to understand where solving these problems comes from. How do we deal with OO's analysis of the sunk cost and the emotional bandwidth? I think why this means movements can strategize better and people can change these structures as a prerequisite to social change. What this means to say is when we understand structures better, it leads into our ability to be able to understand societal structures that oppress us even more. This means to say that we have an increased ability to not only respond towards stimulus that oppress us, but to deal with these stimulus in better means and more logical approaches in which an understanding of emotion does not give us. Thank you.
One, go. The inner child is a concept that in adults, we carry the burdens, the trauma that we did not recognize when we were children. That if we are broken or suppressed as children, we will carry that in adulthood in the form of our inner child. On our side, we want our children to look at their emotions first, to respond to their needs before coming up with solutions. We'll be the first team to give the nuance on emotions and elevate this debate, talking about how we protect the vulnerable better. Our stance here is simple. We think parents ought to teach their children to prioritize their emotions, that if we prove that number one, we treat ourselves better this way, and two, create more equitable social consensus, then we're able to win this debate. Then all rebuttals would be integrated. Let's talk about my first extension on why it's important to prioritize your emotions. This is the analysis. You cannot rationalize your emotions before you feel them. And this is where I talk about the science of emotions. CG is lying. Emotions are not just a primordial survival instinct. Emotions are complex. We don't just feel hunger, or it's not just because of satiety. It comes from ourselves. Psychology is even baffled by emotions simply because we don't fully understand it yet. Now, this is the science. Part of our brain called the amygdala controls our emotions. This keeps a record of every single traumatic and negative experience that we have in life. On their side, when children feel emotions, they jump to solving it, and the amygdala stores those emotions. It feels suppressed because you simply do not give it time to feel, because you simply jump to trying to solve or make solutions towards that emotion. Then, so that amygdala does not erase the emotions. It means that the emotions are still somewhere inside of you. This means that emotions are an intrinsic part of your humanity. Even if it's deprioritized, it will eventually come up because the brain stores it. Then, these hidden and repressed emotions will manifest in everyday life, in everyday decisions, in the relationships that we have, or in how we treat ourselves. This is the knowledge that psychology is built upon, that no matter how good we are at suppressing emotions, we cannot do it successfully without sacrificing our quality of life. How does this manifest? Number one, talk about how people who have parental trauma and do not deal with it, they eventually suffer from abandonment issues, from failed relationships, codependency issues, which greatly clear the capacity to make meaningful relations, and they don't even know it because they don't recognize how broken they are. Or secondly, how people who are told to be more logical and less emotional end up having anger management issues or unknowingly being manipulative or abusive. The body keeps the score, meaning emotions show up in weird ways that we cannot comprehend. This breaks the deadlock. What are the impacts of government bans, therefore? Number one, it means that children on their side will grow up intrinsically broken. Even if government's model has some benefits and they don't get fooled by corporations or etc., as we get these benefits, we create immitigable and irreparable harms that manifest in the worst way. That you might be the best in your job or the best in school or the best in managing your finances, but you become addicts to deal with the void, or you're not able to form healthy relationships with other people then. For example, how slavery broke the structure of Black homes, removing fathers from the picture. It created generational trauma of Black families, children without fathers. Now Black women try to desperately teach their children logic to survive, to get jobs, but because a lot of Black children are intrinsically broken with the absence of a father, taking economic factors out of the picture, they put themselves in dangerous positions like taking drugs or engaging in violence to fill that void. Then this harms the children that they wanted so desperately to protect. But the second harm is that you create a social consensus with the misemotions, and this is where we take them at their best case, that now more children are logical. We think this is still bad because emotions will come up either way, because there will still be some underprivileged people who cannot do that. Talk about minorities who have 2 to 3 jobs, who cannot teach your children to stop their emotions, or minorities who are in such an immense social trauma that they cannot learn to just be logical. In government side, government's children will become a generation of adults who will see minorities as socially unacceptable. They will have narratives like the angry Black woman, or call them snowflakes for being angry at social structures. Or when immigrants come with their sad stories, logical conservatives do not care. Talk about how white people who grew up middle class taught their children logic to thrive in their schools and to thrive in their eventual jobs, and stop them if they're overly emotional. It means that they are more likely going to be unempathetic. We harm these minorities more because it's easy to validate their harmful beliefs towards them. How conservatives have this banner of facts over feelings. It is not true that if you understand structures, you respond to these people, because these structures ultimately affect people whose emotions you do not accept. Then this is where I talk about my converse, how the best thing we can give to our children are tools to respond to their emotions as early as possible. In our world, we teach children to recognize emotions. We don't stop emotions. We teach them to feel anger, to express it. We set aside our children, and when they make tantrums, we have them take breaths and discuss their anger with them. What we don't want them to do is when they feel something bad, we go straight to rationalizing it. We go straight to telling them how to respond to it. Then 2 impacts in this. Number 1, personal. When these children face negative circumstances, talk about if they're minorities and face microaggressions, they don't just kill people, they don't just shout or endanger themselves, they still set themselves aside, breathe, they process their emotions to come up with out of the situation safe. Government says that children will scream and punch when they're angry, but this is normal child behavior. But when parents validate it early on, when they grow up, their inner child is in tune with their emotions because their parents give them the tool to recognize their emotions and deal with it in the healthy way. That in the future, it's unlikely for them to scream and shout to other people. It's unlikely for them to look irrational because they took their time to breathe, because they know their emotions are important. And this is in direct response with CG. It's not likely that they're going to be fooled with corporations also, because you took your time to recognize your emotions. You know that you don't need to buy that doll because you know that it's not going to fill some void inside you. Then, even in the worst case that you have a terrible way of showing your emotions, we think this is the only time you'll know how to correct it. Because if you recognize it and you recognize that your emotions are an important part of you, you have to take solutions to solve it. It means that you might go to therapy. It means you might have to inform your friends that you have anger management tendencies. And it means that on our side, this is the only way we create solutions for those kinds of people. Then let's talk about my second impact on how we create a social consensus that's more equitable for far more people. On our side, when minorities are angry at white people, and these white people are taught to prioritize their emotions. But before I discuss that, I'll take up UI from OG.
Yeah, taking them aside, telling them to understand those emotions, that's exactly the same model that everyone has been operating in this debate. So your side isn't mutually exclusive. But regardless, all the benefits in this debate so far take place in the future, which is speculative. But if there are problems that children will experience, like sexual predation, how can we protect them?
Okay, look, our side is different. When we take them aside, we tell them, you can scream, you can feel your emotions because your emotions are important. On your side, when children are angry, you tell them, okay, you're angry because they're bullied, trying to shout at you. You don't give time to let them make solutions. You just push them to make solutions. You don't give them time to feel their emotions. We think that's so bad because of the science of emotions. Then let's talk about the social consensus that we create. When minorities are angry at white people, and white people are taught to deal with their emotions, they recognize the emotions of these minorities, and they will understand that it's a cry for help. They will remember the times that when they were angry and they screamed, and they know that their parents responded with them with empathy. Therefore, I must respond with this person with empathy. Then on our side, we create a social consensus that accepts emotions. It means there's more political will to respond to the needs of these minorities. We don't dismiss their facts over feelings, but we tell them that because you are angry, I care about you. Because you're angry and my parent cared about me, I will be empathetic about you. We say that their feelings are valid because it's caused by a larger problem. I think for all those reasons, we create a far more equitable society. We think that emotions are so important to make you a whole adult. For all those reasons, very proud to oppose. Thanks.
Two, and one. It is astounding to me that the problem that opposition identifies is that people are too repressed when in the era of cancel culture, where individuals are asked to use social media as an outlet, when individuals and advertisements encourage people to give in to their emotions, to buy them new products, to indulge in their emotions and vote for political actions, that emotions are not accepted within the status quo. The problem is the exact opposite, that there are too many emotions, that people lack the ability to step back, and there's a perpetual cycle that continues that makes this policy necessary. The first thing I want to evaluate in this debate is a lot of the opening government claims about, the shared opposition claims about why empathy in the absence of a logical approach would likely be the default and people would be more in tune with the emotions. The assumption of this claim is that the default space that they can retreat to is some quiet area where they have all the tools that they need to create this. The problem here is the claim that opposition makes, that emotions are complex, and that just because you express your emotions does not mean you have the tools to effectively deal with it. And this is where I want to point out an intuition pop. Just because you express your emotions and just because your parents accept those emotions does not mean you automatically become well-adjusted. Individuals who are trans often have a tendency to become narcissistic, to become extremely spoiled, and there's a massive gap in mechanization from the entirety of opposition bench for why those things are necessarily healthy, insofar as good child rearing can often invalidate the incorrect parts of your emotions and learning to separate them. Secondly, they never prove to you why parents are inherently the equivalent of child psychologists who know exactly what to say and what to do. The problem is they don't have the research and evidence to suggest those types of things at all times, especially if the context that opposition wants to talk about are broken families, are people who are poor, are individuals who don't have access to this. So where exactly are they going to likely defer to those cases? We will argue that they will likely defer to their own intuitions, their own judgments, which are often can be wrong. There are documented evidence that there are certain things that improve your ability to manage your emotions. Things like mindfulness meditation, things like taking a walk before you say something you regret, things like being able to stop and do things like meditation. But insofar as individuals do not default to that and do not think about whether or not my emotions are valid, is this action correct? Is this emotional response something I should do? They are more likely than not to default to those responses. So I don't think our opposition actually proves why people will be more reflective, because they will always feel like expressing their emotions are the end all be all. Kenny characterizes these are intrinsic biological responses that are feeling good for people. So there is no capacity to ever leave those states. And insofar as people can leave the trigger states, what are you met with? What coping mechanisms do you get? You are more likely to associate it with things like social media, tweeting, dealing with it online, comparing yourself to other things. The social types of things you discuss are not necessarily good insofar as those things are necessarily there. So therefore, the claim that you get for emotional stability on opposition is not one that is contingent to the interests of those people, because they never properly responded to our claims, but are more likely to be incorrect decisions. Why then does our extension win this in terms of our claims? Number one, because we're able to establish that there's a logical priority. We don't need to say that the repression needs to happen forever. But in the moment, you need to find the correct response and the logical framework and the approach of logic before you choose to indulge in your emotions. There is no evidence to suggest that those things are inherently mutually exclusive. But even if it is mutually exclusive, we're willing to take that trade-off, because you're more likely to do things like stay in school. You're more likely to do things like prioritize things like security, getting a good job, and prioritizing those interests before you do anything else, which means that you're likely to get, even if you're emotional repression, that is probably less than like not going to school or dropping out of those chains, prioritizing and railing against the system. So most of those things are out. So in terms of why are children better off in schools and bullies, number one, they have no guarantee that schooling or other people are going to be good actors. But insofar as parents are the ones that children have parental figures, they will more likely than not inculcate these approaches and do this in ways to correct them, which increases the capacity they will be fine. Before I move on, opening opposition, go ahead.
Childhood is the best time to develop these things because you don't have other responsibilities and people pressuring you for it. To safeguard against manipulation is when you learn to recognize your emotions. You don't get that.
Look, everyone has emotions their entire fucking lives. Like, people themselves will need to process their emotions if they want to work, if they want to sleep. It is not clear to me why the extension on framing that your emotions are relational, that they exist in conjunction with other people, that things like therapy and those things exist, means that there are other mechanisms to process your case. But the logical approach, the instinctive circuit breaker that prevents you from entering a cycle of nativism and always indulging in those things, can only happen in childhood. So that's the case. I want to talk about minorities and neurodivergent individuals. I think a lot of CO is derivative from OO in this instance. Number one, neurodivergent individuals. The problem here is that the only reason why we even know neurodivergent people are a problem is because we study them. Insofar as these people are the empathetic response to these people historically, the people who were seen as weird or people who are seen as intellectually handicapped, and the reason why the words autistic and things like that were often used as slurs was because the default empathetic response was to appreciate things in the short term. They say you will be empathetic, but empathy is selective. It is always premised on who you're close to, who you're proximate to. So if you're talking about minorities, and if you're talking about which is worse in terms of access, minorities are less likely to access the goodwill of majoritarian individuals who benefit from their oppression in the first place. So it is not likely for empathy to be changed. In fact, it was minorities who used the language of logic, who utilized those things and the ability to call out those things that were able to mobilize this. So in fact, if you say neurodivergent people can access their emotions, guess what? People with Asperger's, people who have developed or emotional disorders, don't actually have the tools to do this. So insofar as people are predicated on their emotional expressiveness, these people are more likely to be ostracized. So in fact, those things are far, far worse on your end. And the intellectual and logical understanding that this is how we give emotions, we give physical or tactile stimulation, those are the things that actually improve those things. For minorities, we accept that closing opposition's burden push of like extremely traumatized children. The problem is that trauma comes from external circumstances. The fact that you're poor, the fact that your parents can't take care of you, regardless of what their approach is, those individuals are still likely to exist on either side of the debate. The question to assess this question is how you change that. Number one, we argue that insofar as people know about their logical rights and needs, they are more likely to ask for them. They are more likely to say, we need more spaces for people to do this. Insofar as this is often the need for the societal presumption to give access to education, ensure more spaces for logic, and ensure prerequisites such as education, the internet, whatever, as a basic human right, it is more likely for society to adapt to those external circumstances at the point where people actively recognize and tell people that this is what they want, and in the future, gain the ability to move beyond the societal transgressions, the anti-poor narratives, the advertisement that says you will always have to numb this with other policies. That can only happen in a world where, number one, people are logical enough to see reality as it is, but secondly, have the tools and desires to accomplish those things. It's not perfect, we agree, but we don't live in a perfect world. All CG proves is that it is better. And for that reason, we're very proud to proceed.
Trigger warning, I'm gonna say a lot of
is that they mistake emotion from mishandled emotions. Cancel culture, punching someone, impulsive buying, or being manipulative are manifestations of wonky and unprocessed emotions. Because emotions are not a bad thing. It's our friend. It helps us create decision. It protects us from any extraneous harm that comes to us. There's something that's very unique with closing opposition. Because unlike our opening, we didn't just deal with our government by being insistent on what we actually want. We actually engage on them and prove that even if we actually believe them, we're still gonna win this debate. I have two parts in my speech. Firstly, I'll talk about where do we better respond to extreme emotions better. And secondly, why is the society better on our side? The first thing that I want to pose is that you're asking too much from children. Holding in extreme emotions is ultimately taxing and will ultimately manifest in trauma, like what Army said. Hans said that parents are not equipped enough to deal with emotions because they're not like psychiatrists, right? But if it's true that parents are not that smart, then it's symmetric because that means parents are also unable to be more logical on your side. So the fairest part of the debate is when we assume that parents have the capacity to do either way. Let's deal with extreme emotions. Because in OG's side, they are not allowed to express too much emotions, right? If you want to be angry, like scream somewhere else or try to be logical about it, right? Your parents are going to tell you it's not a big deal. You don't have to cry. Just think about your happy thoughts. That means children on government side are not familiar with their most extreme emotion. And this is something really exclusive with closing government. Cancel culture is a manifestation of repressed emotion. People are not in tune with the worst side of them. That's why when it comes out, they don't know how to deal with it, right? Sure, maybe children on our side start to be like crybabies or be angry all the time, right? But this is better because at least they're still young and they cannot shoot people yet. The worst they can do is punch their classmate. That means they still have more time to get in tune with their emotion, to use it as a tool, and to prevent them from being sociopaths. In government side, when people were taught from the young age that they cannot be too extreme, in time where they finally burst because of the repressed emotion that they have, they're not going to be in tune with their emotion. And I would posit that there will become a time where they're going to face a lot of big problems that they're not prepared for. Like someone killed their family member, or that they're being oppressed, or that something really, really bad happened to them. That's going to push them to ultimately cannot hold it in anymore because logic does not always win, especially in times of these really, really bad things, right? That means children are have more propensity to be sociopaths in government side when they don't know how to deal with their emotion and they're not familiar with their most extreme emotion, right? That means people on our side, they know that if they hate a particular influencer on Twitter, they should just be angry in private because being angry all online will not help them at
Hi
all.
everyone, we're about to release the results for the partial double octave finals.
Wait, sorry.
First room to be announced is going to be 1-1, where opening gov was LSE A,
Are you
opening
guys hearing
opposition
this?
was Sheffield
Yes.
A, closing gov was Ateneo 4.
Who
and
is unmuted
A.
currently?
To announce the results, could we have the chair come up?
Let me just check who is muted.
Hi, Bel. I think you're connected on Discord because I saw it coming from your end.
Do you keep hearing this? Belle,
Yeah,
do you keep hearing the announcements?
Thank you, Pranav.
I can
Moving
still
on to
hear
the
them
second
now.
room.
It's on your Discord. It is likely on your Discord. You have to disconnect from announcements on Discord.
Closing opposition was Auckland A. Can we have Daniel?
I can't hear anything.
Check the chat, Bell.
I'm so sorry. That was Discord. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. I posted your 315. You can.
what's also good with our children recognize extreme emotions is that they can also respond better to other people when their extreme emotions come out. So maybe let's assume that one children was not able to be in tune with their emotions that much. So they do an outburst, they like scream at their classmates, right? We think we also give the capacity to our children how to respond better to this, to understand that this person is not a dangerous person, but is a person that's really, really just oppressed. We think that these are things that we carry through adulthood when white people are now able to recognize that this woman being mad is not just a manifestation of her being crazy, but it's because of pressure that they've experienced for a long time. That means you create this check and balance in the society and self-correcting mechanism when a lot more children or a lot more people knows how to deal with extreme emotion. But even if it's true that you can deal with extreme emotion and government side, why is that still bad? Because Army told you that you create a an artificial societal consensus. When people are going to show extreme emotions, they're going to be alienated. They're going to be called crazy. That means you also damage peer relationships that you can create from childhood to adulthood. And then CG said that we don't have to study our emotions. We pick it up from society. No, you pick up emotions from society, but you have to learn how to manage with your emotions. I don't know how they do that in CG. And then Kenny said that people are ultimately forced to go to therapy when they grew up being logical on their side. But I think that when people grow up with the idea that emotions always come second, how are people going to have natural incentive in the future to go to therapy and finally deal with repressed emotion? Probably they're only going to therapy because they are forced to go to therapy. They're already damaged and broken and they cannot do it anymore. Therapy is more likely on our side. When children grow up and think that emotion should always come first, they know that a portion of their salary should go to therapy and things that are good for their mental health. We think that we create healthier adults in closing opposition side. I'll take a POI now from OG.
You can't understand emotions if you can't logically break it down. Why is it the interest of parents to endanger their children to things like sexual predation because they were told not to prioritize logic for the sake of preventing future repression, which has alternatives in the future?
No, because the tools that you use when you rationalize emotion through logic are things that are outside emotion, like things like, oh, we're just gonna do something else, it's okay, like you can beat them up later, things like that. But when you rationalize emotion through emotion, you get to learn with it, you get to be in tune with it. Lastly, let's talk about society. The first thing that OG said is that, we have to conform to societal norms, which is like very serious things like that. But we don't have to conform to this now. Let's start with our children. Let's make a new generation where emotion is the norm. Because I don't think that corporations can just take advantage of you when they're emotional, because firstly, they already take advantage of you because of like advertising becoming smarter and the technology being used by corporation. We think that on our side, we better help people manage this impulsive behavior for corporations because they know and they are in tune with their emotion. We also think that we win the issue on minorities, right? Because Army told you that emotions are ultimately important with minorities because when you tell everyone that they have to be always logical, you alienate the people that cannot be logical anymore. Government side did not prove any particular mechanization why everyone, even the most oppressed, can be logical. We also think that emotion is the most persuasive tool that minorities can use to bring urgency into their issues, to tell them that this is not a matter of talking anymore, this is a matter of acting because people are already dying. Lastly, we think that emotion is the most accessible response for these people. For them to be able to survive, they need to have an outlet. Even if they're not going to create a change, they need to be still healthy in their minds because this is their best tool to fight oppression. And if people are oppressed and traumatized and repressed in government side, you cannot create any particular change. Children and people are ultimately better in a world where we deal with our emotions. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that speech. And